Rudy Giuliani, KSM. We're going to bring him back to New York. What does it mean for New York?
It means an additional security concern over and above all the rest that we have, and one that's unnecessary, which is the worst part of it, because we don't have to have this trial in New York. It's one thing if the only place you could try him was in New York. Of course we would then do it, and the New York City Police Department is the best at handling security. But why add this additional burden to a city that's already considered to be one of the prime targets for Islamic terrorists?
It puts the city at risk. I mean, you can't deny it puts the city at greater risk.
The city's at risk anyway.
Right.
Why add a risk that is not necessary? It's one thing to add a risk that is necessary. If the only place to bring him to justice would be here, in a civilian court, fine. But when you've already created military courts, when they've been upheld now
by the Supreme Court,
when they've been fixed by Congress, and you're going to try other people in those courts.
Yeah.
Now, how do you make the distinction between the ones you're going to try in civilian courts and the one you're going to try in military? This makes, on 100 different grounds, this is one of the more irresponsible decisions that I've ever seen made.
Yeah, I think, and as a harsh critic of the Obama administration, I think it's one of their worst decisions. Here's my question, though. He already admitted A to Z that he was the architect, that he helped plan all of this, and even was willing to accept the death penalty. We had the verdict.
Right.
Now, is it possible, you're a former prosecutor, is it possible that he goes into court and all the information that we gathered from him, because he didn't have Miranda rights,
yeah, of course,
it's inadmissible?
That's right.
All of it.
That's right. And what is the only justification for this? The justification for it is we're going to show the world that we can give a fair trial. Well, the reality is the president and the attorney general, as far as I can tell, have already said he's guilty, and they've already said he should have the death penalty. Now, what kind of trial is that?
Yeah, that's a good point.
This is like the Old West. Yeah. You're guilty, you're going to be executed, but now we're going to try you.
Yeah, we'll try you after the fact. But the danger, seems to me, is the precedent. Going back to the Supreme Court, going back to World War I, World War II, Civil War, for crying out loud. You know, we already had established this for a reason. Do you think this is rooted in the idea that this is a man-caused disaster and not a war on terror?
Yeah, I think it is, as I've said before, I think this is a going back to a pre-9/11 mentality. I think it's going back to the way we looked at terrorism in the 1980s and the 1990s and ignoring all of the history from 1993 up until the attack of September 11, the attacks in London, and all the other things that have happened. We made the mistake in 1993 of thinking of it as a civil thing, as a criminal act. Well, we should learn from that mistake. Instead of learning from the mistake, we're not going to repeat it.
Do you think, as I do, and we brought this up earlier in the week with former Vice President Cheney, do you think this is about putting George Bush on trial, putting Guantanamo Bay on trial, putting the vice president on trial, putting the United States on trial, enhanced interrogations? You think there's a motivation here?
I hope it's not, but it will result in that.
It will.
Whether that's the intention or not, the typical defense in any trial is to put the government on trial. And that is what the defense will be doing. The defense will be putting the government on trial for their unfair methods, for alleged torture. I mean, I don't think a lot of it is torture, but they will allege that it's torture. And, of course, a lot of it will be exaggerated, a lot of it will be lies, a lot of it will be fictitious, and it will focus attention on what allegedly America did wrong, as opposed to the horrible acts of terrorism that were perpetrated on innocent New Yorkers.
And what's going to be the headline? As we pick up the newspaper every day, is the headline going to be, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed accuses the U.S. of waterboarding me 180 times? Is that what it's going to be?
Of course it will be. I mean, that'll be a very substantial part of the discussion. It'll be a very substantial part of the whole scenario of the trial. And the reality is, the distinction makes no sense. I don't understand it. I don't understand what the Attorney General is saying when he says, if it's a military target, we'll try them in a military court. But if it's a civilian target, we'll try them in a civilian court.
It doesn't make sense.
Well, first of all, they attacked the Pentagon?
Yeah.
As far as I can tell, that's a military
You know what their answer to that was? Well, there were more civilians killed.
Well, we're going to count the number?
Pentagon.
And since when is an attack on civilians not an act of war?
An act of war.
What was Pearl Harbor?
An act of war.
That was an act of war. The fact is, in many ways, a military action, an act of war against innocent civilians, is even more heinous than an act of war against military compounds.
Mr. Mayor, this is a man-caused disaster. the war on terror doesn't exist, apparently, in this administration.
Well, that is part of the whole way that this administration is looking at things that I find very, very disturbing. This is not a man-caused disaster.
It's a terror.
It's coming out of a very specific philosophy. It's the philosophy that underlined the entire attack of 1993, the attacks in East Africa, the attack on the Cole, the attack on September 11, the attack in London, some of the things that have been planned for now. This is an ongoing thing that is happening. And in 1993, you can understand why it was tried in a civil court, in a civilian court,
right,
as a criminal act. We didn't understand it all at that point. We didn't have that full history.
But now we know it's a war.
But now we know what it is. Bin Laden, since then, has declared war on us. Mm-hmm. We've declared war on him. Mm-hmm. And why we're treating this as if it's some kind of a criminal act and it has to be tried in a civilian court makes no sense at all.
Mr. Mayor, thank you for being with us for our special tonight. We really appreciate it. Thank you. And coming up, a closer look at the legal hurdles